Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. All right, friends and familiars. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have a writer who has blended the elements of witches, vampires, and quantum physics. She's joining me today to discuss her recent novel entitled As Those Above Fall. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Catlyn Ladd. All right, friends and familiars, we are live on YouTube, Twitch, Trovo, and X with Catlyn Ladd. Catlyn, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining me on this 21st day of August 2024. I came across your work on Bookstagram, specifically as one of the authors from the distinguished press Winding Road Stories, and was curious to know what unique spin you were going to put on the vampire narrative. Once I began reading the book, I found that not only were you adding unique elements to the existing lore, but you were also transcending it by blending elements of witchcraft and quantum physics. Needless to say, I was blown away, enjoyed the book, and I'm excited to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so kind of you. I'm glad you picked up the quantum physics. That's awesome.
Oh, yeah. I'm definitely all about the actual science, but it sounds like the ramblings of a high person. It's such a weird a weird culmination. Well, so the book is about a young woman named Zora who is grieving over her lost love, Alex. Desperate, she considers suicide, but opts to attempt to resurrect him instead. However, despite her psychic abilities and self-identification as a witch, she's unable to raise him from the dead, so she enlists the help of a vampire. And that is where the story begins. So, what elements of witches and vampires do you find to be synergistic, which makes combining the two not only more interesting, but more powerful?
I've consumed a lot of fiction over the years that combines vampires and witches or has elements of witchcraft and the monstrous. And I am really interested in the ethical questions around power. And so with Zora's ability to manipulate reality almost however she wants, I wanted to write a story about someone who had immense power, but was thwarted in certain ways. And so that's sort of where the witchcraft element came from. And then I just love vampires. I've always wanted to write a vampire story. I grew up on Anne Rice and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and True Blood. And so I'm just a fan of that genre and wanted to put my own spin on it. And so that's sort of where the witch vampire dynamic came from. And I got curious because most of the fiction out there separates the vampire from the witch, right? And so the vampires and the witch have some sort of dynamic, they have some sort of interaction or relationship or conflict. And I got interested in this question of like, okay, so what if you took someone really powerful and turned them into a vampire? Like, what would that look like? Would they become more powerful? Would they self-destruct? Like, what is that? So those were all sort of the dynamics that I was playing around with when writing this book.
Well, it seemed that an unconscious desire from Zora, which she wasn't totally aware of, conjured a vampire named Zeke. Was she consciously aware of conjuring Zeke, or was she not really cognizant of what kind of power she actually had? And what about her desired conjured a vampire specifically?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, and honestly, I don't exactly know. So because they exist as their own characters, but I don't think that she was conscious of it at all. But what she was doing was she got very focused on this question of death and what death is, and if she could reverse it, and or if she could somehow enter the land of the dead to pull back someone. And the vampire is the manifestation of death. So really, Zeke is death, and that's what she conjures, or is a representation or stand-in for death. And so I don't think she consciously thought, I'm going to summon a vampire now. Instead, it was all of that power that she has, which became unfocused and chaotic because of the state of grief that she was in, that ended up sort of, I don't know, it didn't call Zeke exactly, but he came into her life at a particular point in response to her desire for death. That's sort of what I have in my head of what was happening there and how they ended up meeting. But really, I'm super excited to release this book into the world and see what readers think, because that's what I think happened. But I think that there's various ways to interpret why they met when they did.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's no more uh, extreme, obsessive way to identify with death than to contemplate suicide. You think possibly that had something to do with zeroing in on such a predatory, undead, immortal state of being?
Absolutely. And I'll be honest, I played with different ways of starting the book, of getting them to meet. And because I was thinking of exactly that, because she has gotten to a point where she feels like the only real option available to her is suicide at the point where she and Zeke meet. Um, but she she simultaneously has been this person who really enjoys her life and really loves being alive and really loves having power and being who she is. And so to get to that point is really a statement about her desperation. And so the suicidal ideation and then the manifestation of death in the form of a vampire, those things come to a head, and that's sort of the catalyst for what else happens. But I was thinking, even like that she could actually try to attempt suicide, and then Zeke could sort of save her, and like this and that and the other. And ultimately I decided not to go that route because I really wanted them to be autonomous. I didn't want him to be a savior to her. And so I ended up going a different route, but I was definitely playing around with all of those ideas, like right from the very beginning.
Gotcha. Well, Zora and Zeke are both described as beautiful people who use glamour to get what they want and to entrap people when necessary. The use of glamour is not a fictional concept and is used in the real world all the time. What fictional elements did you add to the force of glamour in your story to enhance its strength for use by both Zora and Zeke?
Yeah. Both of them use it with absolute intention. And I also think that they are more able to use glamour than your run of the mill average human being.
Mm.
Although in different ways. And so Zora, because she has this power that she calls witchcraft, can really just, what she's doing is she's actually changing how people perceive her, which the ethics of that is also something that's sort of a unstated element of the book. But she's just changing how people see her. And so if somebody has a negative reaction to her or a negative impression of her, she just changes what they think, which is creepy when you think about it. um, and so, there's one point where there's a couple of different points in the book, but there's one point where Zeke kind of calls her on it. He's like, I know what you're trying to do to me, and you can't do that to me. That doesn't work on me. And then there's another point later where, sort of there's this question of like, how much has Zora just changed what people believe about her? And does Alex even love her, or did she like make him love her? Right. So I'm playing around with sort of those like super weird, creepy, ethically vague, ambiguous, bad questions. And so that's what Zora's doing, is she just changes what people think about her, or changes how people perceive her or react to her or whatever. With Zeke, it's an aspect of his vampirism. And so I love this idea of a predator who has all of these elements to that predatory nature. Like he is physically attractive, but you're never sure if he's just a human person who happens to be attractive who became a vampire, or if he's been sort of transformed by the vampirism into someone who people find attractive, right? And so with Zeke, it's his ability to sort of glamour people is an aspect of his vampirism, and it's them responding to what he's giving off, whether that's pheromones or whatever. um, but they're responding to him so that they become prey, essentially, right? Because he's this predator. And so the glamour is working with them or from them in different ways. And so then, of course, when they meet each other, it's this meeting of two different ways of glamoring each other that sort of don't work in the same way as they're used to manipulating humans. And so that's part of what, sort of the dynamic between them is. Zeke sees her because he can see past the glamour. So he sees who she really is, which theoretically no one has really ever done. And so then she, of course, has to grapple with being seen in that super honest way that she's been able to hide from everyone else, right? And so I think that's just an interesting element of the relationship between the two of them. And then, of course, he sees her sort of as she really is, and he doesn't run away from her exactly like he sort of does in moments, like he withdraws from her, but he's still interested in her, right? It doesn't just turn him off. And so that's sort of an interesting dynamic in relationships too, right? Like if somebody really sees you for who you really are they going to run screaming, or are they going to be like, oh, you're one of my people? We hope it's the second one and not the first one.
Yeah. Yeah, it seemed like as far as Zeke was concerned, he was a classically handsome man, but he had these accents of being a predator that kind of enhanced it. Like, didn't his eyes gleam like sort of a kind of the way light catches a dog or a cat's eyes, that reflection? What else am I forgetting?
So his eyes always shift to silvery when he's hungry and when he's like on the hunt, right? Because normally he has gray eyes, but sort of when someone strikes his comes across his radar, so to speak, his eyes will sort of shift to silvery. And then he also smells like desert after the rain, is what she says. And so I never come right out and say this, but what I had in my head there was that he's emitting pheromones that people are responding to, that are attracting people, which makes it easier for him to feed and find prey. And so those are sort of the two things that I played with to indicate that he is a sort of classically pretty person, and that the vampire shift has enhanced him in other sort of more supernatural ways, if you will.
Yeah, you talk about pheromones. I read I forget which book it was, one of the many books I've read on body language, saying how one of the hardest things or signs, micro expressions, I guess they're called, to hide when you're aroused is nasal flaring, taking in pheromones.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I have to admit that because I had come across that factoid at some point in my study of whatever I was studying. And I have to admit, I have never thought in all of my, moments in my life where I've wanted to sort of mask whatever it was I felt, I've never thought about what my nose was doing. Nope, never
Mhm.
once.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's so, yeah. I mean, I can see why you would not be cognizant of that. Because, like, of all of the things to focus on, who's focused on,
The
the
nostrils.
widening of their nostrils? Well, circling back to the book, I noticed that there was particular attention, as we were just speaking about, paid to the detail of the olfactory sense with the smells of people, places, and things. And you mentioned Zeke having like this desert air smell. There is a character by the name of Malachi that had the very recognizable smell or scent of jasmine. So, was this heightened sense of smell meant to highlight the fact that they were predators, or was it a literary device designed specifically to shape the reader's experience? And can you kind of dig a little bit more into that?
I think both. So the way that humans perceive the vampires as smelling is an indication of their irresistibility, right? But I always appreciate any sensory information that gives me as a reader a full sensory experience of what the characters are going through or where they are. And so the other thing is that vampires also have a heightened sense of smell. And so their senses are also heightened. And so there are points in the story where the vampire characters smell things either as prey and it identifies prey to them, or else they pick up on how potential prey smells. But then they also encounter really bad smells that are overpowering to them in a way that they might not be overpowering to a human. And so, and it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about how I used aroma specifically in the story because I always try when I write, I always try to touch on the five senses where appropriate. But I think that I'm kind of sensitive to aromas. Like I notice how people smell, which might sound kind of creepy, but it's true. um, and so I noticed that, and then I also sort of, notice just other aromas in my environment, whatever that happens to be. And so I think that's just sort of me putting myself into the writing. Like this is sort of how I experience the world, or one of the ways I experience the world, and so it's just sort of coming out in the characters. But I will say that like my beta readers. Also picked up on that and actually wanted more of it. And so I heightened it at particular points, like sort of the middle portion of the book takes place in a hospital, and Zeke is like constantly being like overwhelmed with the aromas of the hospital, and that's directly because my beta readers wanted more of that. um,
Even the unpleasant smells.
Right, right. The
Yeah.
unpleasant smells. Yeah, to balance out maybe the more pleasant smells. And so I was like, okay, I can give you more smells. That's fine. And so, that's just because of reader feedback, that I
Uh-huh.
sort of heightened that element of it.
Gotcha. Well, if I remember correctly, Zeke was approximately 900 years old and came from a time when men adorned themselves, which is why he adopted a punk look in the time period of the book's setting. So, can you tell us a little bit about the time period and the setting he came from, the type of dress you're referring to, and the time period in which the book is set? If that's not
Sure.
too much of a mouthful.
We'll go one piece at a
20
time
questions.
and remind me. So, as is often the case with writers, I have a whole backstory for Zeke that some of which made it into the book and some of which, didn't make it into the book. So Zeke was born in Greece, about 1100. And he his mother was a Greek woman, but his father was a Viking. And so the Vikings were spreading out around the world. This was sort of toward the end of the Viking Age, but they made it all the way to Greece. They established trade routes with Athens. And so the idea of a Viking ending up in Greece is not historically inaccurate. And so Zeke was the product of this union between this Viking and this Greek woman, but his father stayed in Greece, and his mother, her family were merchants, which makes sense about how they would have met. And so at the time in Athens in 1100 as a port city, it was a very international city because where it is, sort of in the, I don't know, the bottom, the south part of the Aegean, you were getting trade routes from Egypt, from what's now Israel and Jordan. Currently are parked there, but from Alexandria, from Cairo, from Morocco, even on the western side of the Mediterranean, as well as land routes from as far away as India and China, which were coming into the Mediterranean area, and then ships or caravans ending up in Athens. And so, very international city. So, a lot of different wares from all over the Far East and the Middle East ending up there, and even some from Europe, although Europe was still doing the whole Dark Ages thing a little bit. So, not maybe as much. They were certainly importing things, exporting, maybe not so much. But, and so, Zeke would have been, as a human, as a young man, he would have been in this fairly international environment, lots of different languages being spoken, lots of different goods from all over the world, and he would have had access to that in this sort of merchant family. He would have seen a lot of that coming and going. But then, after he becomes a vampire, he then lives through, the medieval period, the Renaissance, right? He lives through this time period, and it just absorbs that, all of that culture. And so for the majority of his life, especially upperclassmen, of course, would have dressed and worn makeup and wigs and all of that kind of stuff. And so then he gets plonked down in the 20th century in America, and he's like, oh, this is kind of boring. And so sort of at the time that Zora meets him, he has this sort of edgier look. I do envision that the story is set relatively contemporary. There's not a lot of reference to things like phones and cell phones and computers and, things like that. I mean, some, but like Zeke has a phone that he picks up at one point. But, and so I do consider it to be relatively contemporary. But the characters are sort of involved. It's not like they sit down and do Google searches at any point during the story. They're way too busy, like figuring out how to save or damn the world, depending on what's happening. And so, so Zeke is sort of, he has this sort of punk rock metal edge kind of look. And honestly, to be completely honest, I'm also deeply influenced by the character of Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, like no question. And so, I'm also kind of playing with that because that's kind of fun, right? And so this isn't quite, Spike fanfic, but it's in the ballpark. And so, I just kind of liked that look for a vampire, right? And so it just made sense. It was pleasing to me aesthetically. And so then I was like, well, okay, if you were 900 years old, you would have gone through all of these fashion eras. And so this would be sort of, and what I like about it is that punk is still current enough for him to be able to move through crowds without anybody really thinking one thing or the other about him. But it's just sort of old fashioned enough at this point that it also sort of indicates that maybe he's not super like keeping up with the times, like, because 40 years to Zeke is like nothing. Right.
Yeah.
Like 1980 was yesterday to him, like really. And so I kind of liked that too. So he was sort of old school while still being able to like move through society fairly easily. So that's sort of my line of thinking on that at any rate. And
Gotcha.
I got to like change his hair color and put him in weird clothes and put him in spikes, and so that was just, I don't know, fun to write about.
Yeah, kind of like a punk chic thing.
Totally. Totally.
Well, there are switches in point of view throughout the book from Zeke to Zora. And does it go to Malachi? I can't quite remember.
No, it's just the two of them.
Just the two of them, yeah. What did the introspective revelations of Zora and Zeke bring to the story that a third-party, unreliable narrator could not?
I really wanted to put the audience in the head of the person, of the character, in a way that third person doesn't quite get to. And I didn't I didn't know that the perspective was going to shift to Zeke when I was writing it. It started as Zora, right? I was first person Zora, because I really wanted to see if I could capture and express what grief feels like from a first person perspective. And so that's where it started. But then I got to a point in the story where I was like, well, I really want the audience to see what Zeke is thinking about Zora. And I couldn't do that because I was inside Zora's head. And so I was like, I'm going to see if I can head jump here. And so I jumped into Zeke's head because I wanted to see what he thought about her and how he was experiencing her. Because all I could do from her perspective was observe her reacting to him. And I wanted to see it from inside his head. And so I jumped into his head. And then when I first brought the book to beta readers, I was like, oh crap, what are they going to think about this? Like, is this going to be okay? And people dug it. They thought it worked. And which was a huge relief to me because I didn't have to rewrite all of Zeke's chapters. Like, okay, whew. And so I loved jumping back and forth between them because I thought I could explore more of the emotional turmoil that's happening in the story, from inhabiting their sort of first person experiences of that. Now, I also did something that so far only one reader has noticed, and this is me perhaps being overly clever, but do with that what you will. So Zeke's chapters are in first person, and Zora's chapters are not in first person, are in present tense, and Zora's chapters are in past tense until she transforms, and then she enters present tense.
Oh.
And so I'm also, I don't know, maybe being a little overly clever there, but it also allowed me to differentiate between the two voices when I was writing them. It was playing with the tenses because I also had to be really careful to keep them really distinct, right? So I didn't ever want Zeke to sound like Zora or vice versa. And so I needed to keep them distinct. And so that's one way that I played with that to keep them distinct was the tenses. And then there was something about that appealed to me about the vampire always living in the present and humans having the tendency to live in the past.
Yeah.
And so I played around with that, and my beta readers either didn't notice or didn't care, and my editor didn't make me change it. So I got away with it.
I guess humans live in the past because they have an expiration date. They don't want to live in the present.
Exactly. And vampires are like, okay, we're good for eternity, theoretically, unless someone kills us or we, do something stupid.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess the point of view switches give you the ability to empathize with both of them, and not the proper term wouldn't be take a side, but maybe consolidate your emotions into one character, so to speak.
Right. Well, and I wanted Zora to remain a sympathetic character. Maybe not entirely. Like, it's not like I'm asking the audience to be on her side entirely and think that she always makes great choices, because she does not. But being in her head, I hoped would convey, give people a sense of, oh, I have experienced similar things. Maybe I'm not acting out in this sort of crazy way that she does, but I can sort of sympathize with where she's coming from. But then shifting to Zeke, I also didn't want Zeke to come across as this like perfectly svelte savior figure, and putting us in his head allowed us to see his turmoil and his doubt and his uncertainty. And it was just fun to write from their different perspectives. I'll be honest. It was just fun to do that.
Yeah. Sometimes that's the only reason you need.
Exactly. Like, I just want to. It's fun.
Well, when it came to what could harm a vampire, I found it very interesting that religious symbols like crosses and holy water couldn't harm vampires unless there was faith behind them. And that seems to indicate to me that it was the power of the mind at work. What are your beliefs on the power of the mind and the proverbial belief in belief?
Mm. I mean, to get perhaps a little overly philosophic, which is very easy for me to
Oh,
do.
please do.
Bring it. Um, I mean, in some way, I think the mind is all there is. Like everything, I mean, Cartesian philosophy tells us that we can't even prove that the external world is real. Like the only thing that we are absolutely certain exists is our own stream of consciousness, our own mind. And so I really feel like everything that we know or we think we know or we believe or think we believe is the mind. That's all it is. And so when we're thinking about true human power, it's the power of the imagination, and it's the power of conviction and belief and emotion and things like that. And so, in some way, I think the mind is the only thing that really exists.
I think,
Um,
therefore, I live stream.
exactly right, exactly right. Updated Descartes. And so, um, the other thing is, of course, I am very familiar. I mean, not perfectly familiar, but I'm very familiar with 20th and 21st century vampire fiction. And one of the things that really fascinates me about the character of the vampire over the course of the 20th century is how the symbols specifically of Christianity, which I didn't stick to that in this book at all, but over the course of the 20th century, the way that Christian symbolism is used to fight a vampire changes drastically. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, and even like if you think about late 19th century with Dracula, um, the to repel a vampire, the symbol had to be like consecrated by a priest. It had to be holy water from a church. It had to be a cross wielded by a priest or blessed by a priest. And then you get to like the early 1970s with like the Hammer films, and you start seeing people like make the sign of the cross with their fingers or with candlesticks or like, and suddenly it's just like this weird empty symbol. And then, like, toward the end of the 20th century, into the 21st century, you start to get this idea that the person wielding the symbol has to have faith. And Stephen King in Salem's Lot may have been one of the first widely popular stories where, when the priest lost his faith, his symbol stopped working against the vampire. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And so, because I didn't want to root this in Christianity, I wanted to peel that off. I wanted it to be any symbol that people believe in. And so if it's, if it's a, I guess if it's a cross or I don't know, Star of David or a pentagram or whatever that no one believes in, it doesn't hurt Zeke, right? But if someone believes in it, it could theoretically be anything. And so this is also tied to that old lore about vampires needing to be invited into your home. Well, so what I did is I pulled these two things together and I said, well, the reason that a vampire needs to be invited into the home is because we humans place such a huge value on our home. And in order for it to really feel like a home, we need to believe that it's ours and believe that it's safe and believe that, that it's inviolable in some way. And so that's actually what's keeping the vampire out, is that belief and reverence for the home. And so that's what I'm playing around with there.
Yeah.
Um, but it could, right? So Zora, as a witch, she's not Christian, but she uses other symbols of power, and so they are very effective against Zeke. Like when he first comes to her home, he's like, "Whoa, this place is really protected," and he feels that
Yeah.
because she has put warding spells on it, right? And so. Um, and he can't cross them unless she allows him to. And so, yeah, I was just playing around. I think I was very intentionally playing around with the mental power that belief ascribes things or imbues things with.
Hmm.
Um, just because I don't know, I think that that's interesting, and it was fun to play with, and it was also fun to take the vampire lore out of the Christian canon, right? Like I wanted to separate those two things in a story that I told, because I mean, gosh, even in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, they're using crosses and holy water to fight the vampires, and no one ever explains why. You know, like, like, yeah, but why are we doing this? Like, and even at one point during the series, somebody asked Buffy if she's been saved, and she's like, yeah, no, I never exactly got around to doing that. And I'm like, but they're using crosses and holy water, and you clearly don't believe in them. So, like, what is happening? So I guess maybe I just needed a resolution there, and so I wrote one.
Yeah, no, that's a real interesting how you tied that into the in. Let me see if this is a word. Inviolability, is that a word?
Sure.
Of that,
Well,
of the home.
yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, I've never, knock on wood, I've never had my house broken into, but people that I know that have, that's like one of the most uh, horrifically violating feelings, according to them, to know that somebody has been in your home and been in your stuff. And
Yes.
so,
Yeah, it feels well, you use the word violation, and I feel like that's exactly the right word. Like it,
mhm.
yeah, neither have I, knock on wood. But I've heard the same thing from people, that when someone tries to break into your home, it is like an attack on your being. And so I was like, yeah, I mean, homes are important. And so that's why I guess humans can break into them, but vampires cannot. At least not in my world.
Nope. Well, Zora has a friend named Nicholas who was actually a colleague and friend to Alex. While striking up a conversation with Nicholas, Zeke asks what Zora's master's thesis was, and he replies, quote, an analysis of the similarities and differences between the Aztec goddess of death and the Hindu goddess Kali. And to me, one of the most fascinating religions on earth, and probably the one I would subscribe to if I were religiously inclined, would be the Hindu religion, specifically Shaivism. So I wanted to know, were the characteristics of Zora's life, transformation, and ultimate being influenced by the characteristics of the Hindu goddess Kali? And if so, could you tell us more about it? Because I mean, I know of the Hindu goddess Kali, just surface level stuff. I don't know like how deep the story gets with her.
Sure. Yeah, so I love Hinduism as well. And I agree that if I was going to ascribe to a particular faith or philosophy or tradition, that Hinduism is very, very philosophically sophisticated, and attractive. And so um, I love Hinduism and I love Kali. And what I love about her is that she is an unattached woman. And so while she does, there's some myths about her interacting, quote unquote, with the god Shiva. She's not his consort. She's not his wife. She's not the mother to his children. Like none of that, right? And so Kali is, she was born of anger from the goddess Durga. And so Durga essentially got very frustrated one day with her inability to slay this demon. And it says her face, Durga's face turned black with anger, and Kali leaped fully formed from her forehead. And so Kali is this manifestation of anger, who then is often found on the cremation grounds, on the fields of battle, like drinking the blood of the dead. Like it's this really intense, like super gory. Like I'm like, there's a horror story right there in myth, right there. That's Kali, right? Um, and so, and then in the Aztec pantheon, you have these two deities of the underworld, a male and a female. And yes, they have these names that I always have to look up. And one of them is Mitlantecutli, that's the male one. And then Mictlantecuhtli, I think, is his sister, who's the female. I think I got those right. I'm
That
not
sounds right.
word.
Mictlantecuhtli. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, sound, which I think they actually say in the back of their throat. Anyway, and so the similarities between these two sort of deities associated with death and destruction are really striking, especially since Hinduism in India and the Aztec religion in Central America could not have had any contact with each other. But you get this sort of similar iconography with mounds of skulls and drinking the blood of the dead. And like there's this really similar sort of iconography there, which I think is one of those human universals that's really interesting. And so then that's exactly where Zora is going. Like she is on this path of death and destruction. Like she is rampaging like Kali. And I, I would say that that type of imagery is in the back of a lot of the sort of monstrous feminine characters that I write, just because it's such powerful and compelling imagery. Um, and I have a PhD in religious studies, and
We
so
got we got to bring up Kali here.
yes, God, look at her, right?
Yeah.
I mean the severed head and the dripping tongue, and like, oh man, she is cool.
Yeah.
Skulls in that. Oh yeah, I love her. Yeah,
Hmm.
she's so, and so one I have a tattoo of Kali with all of the blood and the skulls and the serpents and the fire and like all of that.
It with the full color?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I do. And I several years ago now I had the good fortune to go to India. And one of the places that I was just adamant, like, if I'm going to be in this country, I have to go to the huge Kali temple in Calcutta, which is the city of
Oh,
Kali.
wow.
And so, and it's one of the only temples in India today that does regular animal sacrifice, which is pretty intense. Not super down with that, but very, I was there for it. I was willing to,
Uh-huh.
be there, and so yeah, we went to the city of Kali and went to the Hindu temple there, to the temple to Kali, and just like even the way that she's worshipped has this element of like frenzy and madness, which was just really
Wow.
intense. And so that is Zora's energy, especially in the, sort of first to the middle part of the book. That is absolutely the energy that she's manifesting. And so, yeah, it's no accident that I chose those two goddesses to reference sort of academically at that point in the book.
Are you familiar with the Agori?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know their thing is there's the Shaivism, right? They worship
Yes.
Shiva.
Yeah.
Does Kali factor into that at all?
Yeah. So there's a few centers in India where the Agori. So the Agori are renunciates, devotees of Shiva, primarily, and they live. In order to become an Agori, you have to live on the cremation grounds for 12 years. And so, and by live on the cremation grounds, I mean live there full time. Um, and so there is a huge ghat, Ghat, in Varanasi, which is the cremation grounds, which I've also been to, which was, ooh, wow, mind blowing.
Huh.
And the Agori are everywhere in Varanasi. I mean, they're all over the place because many of them live on the cremation grounds there on the banks of the Ganges. And so what they do is they live on the cremation ground, and their altar, if you will, is the burning funeral pyre. And so they are mostly focused, yeah, and they coat themselves. The reason that that their skin is so pale is because that is the ashes
The ashes, yeah.
on the funeral pyres that they rub into their skin. And they also say that it keeps away mosquitoes and stuff. So they claim it has all of these health benefits, which I do imagine that it would probably keep mosquitoes away. But they're so interesting. And And they're focused on Shiva in his sort of destructive form. But what they're really doing is they are trying to. Oh, that's funny. There's that white girl. That's hilarious.
I'm
Oh,
I'm just saying those dreadlocks have probably got
right?
some bacteria in them.
Oh, that's funny. Um, and so, yeah, so they live on the cremation grounds and they worship Shiva in his most destructive form. And what they're really trying to do there is they're trying to recognize or embrace the transience of this existence, right? That everything is just really impermanent. And in order to, they're trying to, I guess, be comfortable with that and recognize that life and death are really two sides of the same coin. And of course, there's all of this philosophy and belief that surrounds the practice. But yeah, they're very cool. Yeah.
So, fun fact: are you familiar with Toastmasters?
Yes,
The
absolutely.
organization.
Yeah.
So I used to go. That's actually where I met my wife, and I did a speech on the Agori.
That's awesome.
And I got best speech, but there was some very disturbed people because I didn't go all the way into like the sexual stuff they do,
Sure, like all of the
but
time stuff. Yeah.
I talked about eating fecal matter and dead
Well,
bodies.
yep,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
dead.
So
So
the
the most important question here is that the speech that your future wife saw?
uh she had seen me do speeches before, but she did see that one. That may have sealed the deal. I don't know.
Okay, that speaks highly of her. I approve. That's awesome.
Yes, it just made me think of that.
Right. That's great.
Well, does Zora's name have any religious context? Like, I don't know, for some reason when I think Zora, I think Zoroastrianism or something like that.
Right. So, the name means like shining light is what the name means, or like light of heaven is what the name means. Like if you look it up. I and so Zoroastrianism, Zoroaster would have been the shining light of heaven. So I don't think that that is an unrealistic connection to make. Um, she named herself, and so when it came out that her name was Zora, I was like, okay, what does that mean? So I looked it up and I was like, okay, this actually really fits. And so, in sort of an ironic way, because of course, if you think of vampires as giving up the sun or giving up the light, and she's the shining light, like in some way she has to give up herself, which I thought was totally appropriate and works with the transformation that she undergoes. And so, so interestingly, the way that this book came about is the first chapter was a short story that I wrote a long time ago, over a decade ago. And one of the first pieces of what I would consider sort of horror or dark fiction that I published. And I thought it was I thought it was a standalone short story. I thought it was done. And in the short story, the characters are not named. They never exchange names. And then the story kept going. The characters kept speaking to me, and 80 some odd thousand words later, I was like, oh, I have a book. Okay. But at some point during that writing process, they named themselves, and it was not, her name was not conscious. When Zeke asked, what's your name? She said Zora. But then, like, is, I don't know, in one of those great moments of like synchronicity or whatever, um, when I looked the name up, I was like, oh, this actually really works. And I can work with this idea of light into darkness and transformation and rebirth that, is also sort of canon in vampire fiction. And so, yeah, so that's where it came from. I wish I could claim that it was me, but it wasn't. It was her.
Interesting. Gotcha. Well, by contrast, you reveal in the book that Zeke is short for Ezekiel, which was a biblical prophet who had the power of resurrection. And when I think of someone being named Ezekiel, you think of kind of like an old-fashioned conservative person, lives in a rural area, something like that. But Zeke, as I mentioned earlier, has this punk chic aesthetic. He's immortal, drives a motorcycle, is very sexual, and is also a killer. So, how did the stark juxtaposition of his name and his character play into the narrative?
Yeah. So Zeke also named himself. His name was Zeke. Now, I love alliteration and I use it a lot in my writing. And so I do think that at least on some subconscious level, like Zeke and Zora having that alliteration appealed to me. But he also named himself. But then he has this conversation with a minor character, and the minor character says, is your name? It's short for Ezekiel, and Zeke says, of course it is. I was like, oh, apparently your name's Ezekiel. Okay, so what does that mean? But this was another moment of just like, I don't know if my subconscious was at work or if it was just a coincidence. I don't know. But okay, so Zeke is 900 years old. He would have been born um, right in the first major schism of Christianity between the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. So the Greek Orthodox Church schismed off in 1057, and Zeke was born about 1100. So he was after the schism. But it was still right in this period of like religious turmoil. So his family would have been some version of Christian. So the idea of him having a biblical name absolutely made sense to me. I was like, sure, all of his siblings probably had biblical names, right? Like the whole family had biblical names, probably. And so, him having a biblical name made sense to me. So then, like with Zora, I was like, okay, well, what does this name mean? And so I looked it up, and it has some like biblical meaning, like chosen by God or something. But one of the meanings of Ezekiel is to fasten upon. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? I have a vampire, and the meaning of his name that he gave himself is to
Uh-huh.
fasten upon. I'm just going to go with that. That's amazing. Because
Uh-huh.
I did have this moment where when this other character asked him, well, it's short for Ezekiel, I was like, oh, is it short for Ezekiel? Or did he just choose the name Zeke for reasons that I would then have to figure out what they were? Or is it actually really short for Ezekiel? And that's when I looked up the name Ezekiel and I was like, oh, yeah, we are absolutely going with that because of that secondary meaning. And so then I just ran with it because I did have this moment where I was like, well, he could have just chosen the name Zeke at some point. His name could be, something completely different, something much more Greek sounding, for example, and he could have just rejected that name at some point. And so Zeke is sort of what he's going by. But I looked up the name and then I just had to go with it.
Mm-hmm. You talk about how the characters name themselves, like almost every writer I interview says, the characters have a mind of their own. Like the only time I get writer's block is when I'm trying to get a character to do something they don't want to do, And it made me think about how we were talking earlier about the mind and how we've all driven someplace we've driven to 80 times before and have had like this whole discursive line of thought in our heads and not even paid attention that we came to three different lights, made a right, a left, kept straight for 2 miles. And then, it's like two
Avoided all
separate
the other
brains.
traffic.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. It's like two separate brains working. Well, it's almost like authors have this third level of consciousness where they've got these characters that have minds of their own, like these separate little minds, the archetypes that Jung talked about. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's
just
like,
popped in my head.
yeah, no, and I love that. I love that reference to Jung, because this idea of, of course, he's interested in this idea of the collective unconscious, but that really is a possible explanation for where these ideas like arise, like from an unconscious level. And that's certainly the experience that I have of writing is the characters start talking and I just start writing. Um, and it's not always like that exactly, but it's certainly when I get a new idea or when I'm trying to explore a relationship between two characters or something like that, they just take off on their own. I'm just following them. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, it feels like it's coming from this other level, this other place.
Absolutely. Well, circling back to the book, the real drama of the story begins when Zora makes an unsuccessful attempt to raise Alex from the dead. And Zora's obsession with the loss of her partner is all consuming. From my study of the occult and psi related phenomena and the characteristics of people purported to have psi ability, one of the most important elements is the ability to maintain intense focus. Like they've even pointed at like high level athletes. They're probably not even aware of it, but they would think that high level athletes that are capable of these high levels of focus might actually have untapped psi ability that they don't even know about. Is the fact that what Zora is attempting to do is complicated by emotional turmoil the reason she was unable to accomplish it? And what is your understanding of the power of the mind and the ability to reach high levels of focus and intention?
Yeah, I mean, humans are amazing. And what we can accomplish when we really set our minds to it, as they say, is extraordinary. Um, and so, I mean, everything from feats of strength and athleticism to oh gosh, I don't know, solving complex math problems and inventing things like calculus, right? I mean, that the amount of focus and brain power there is just incredible. And I definitely see when Zora works her will on the world, if you will, um, she is focusing very, very intently, and in this heightened state of emotional turmoil and grief that she's in when we first encounter her, yeah, she's not capable of doing that. She's also drinking like a fish, like, oh my God, she drinks so much. She's self-medicating and just deadening everything. Um, but that would also completely disrupt your ability to do anything. And so the other piece of this is that um, she's trying to open the gates to the land of the dead so that she can rescue Alex or whatever. And I also wanted to convey that that's really hard. That's not something that would just sort of do one day, one afternoon. Just open the gates and see your grandmother or whatever. It is really hard what she's trying to do. But she's certainly in no state to be able to attempt a feat like that. Um, and I don't know, right? I don't know the answer to that question. She decides that she doesn't have the power necessary to do it. And so that's why she asks Zeke to make her a vampire. Spoiler alert. That, fairly early in the story. But so she asks Zeke to make her a vampire because she thinks that if she's a vampire, she'll be stronger. She'll have more power and she'll be able to do this incredible, crazy thing that she's trying to do. I don't know. Like if Zora was in a happy, focused, well adjusted, non alcohol state of mind, would she be able to do it? I don't actually know. I mean, she's very, very powerful, but I don't know if she could do that or not. She gets really close. Well, she actually succeeds at one point, but then she doesn't really have the power to control it. And she's also in this weird state of transformation there when she actually succeeds. But I mean, she sort of succeeds. And so she's very powerful, but does she have the power to do it without the vampire blood? It's close. It's close. She's almost powerful enough to do it just on her own. Just not quite, but I don't know why not. Is it because she's a crazed alcoholic or is it because she actually I don't know.
Well, I don't know if I should induce the spoiler. This next question would indicate whether or not she was successful in her pursuit of becoming a vampire.
Oh, right. Yeah, I mean, that piece of the story in some ways is I mean, the real driving question is whether or not she's successfully able to open the gates of the dead and get Alex back, right? Like that's the
Mhm.
real driving story. So we absolutely cannot spoil that.
Okay.
But she does. She is very early in the story in pursuit of becoming a vampire. And so, yeah, we can talk about that. Plus, people have been listening for almost an hour at this point. So I feel like we need to reward them with something.
Okay, well, then it's okay to say that it was a long, dangerous, drawn out process, but Zora eventually reaches the level of vampire.
Right.
Okay. Well, so one thing she notices is that in addition to her ability as a witch to see auras, as a vampire, she can now see heat signatures due to her nature as an apex predator. So was that meant to sort of delineate between witches and vampires, witches being spiritual and vampires being purely predatory? Or was it just a difference in power unrelated to a moral compass? And can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, I did use that to indicate or be an indicator of physiological changes that were happening to her on a physical level. And so seeing heat signatures was not necessarily something that she could do, with witchcraft. And so that's my sort of shorthand way of indicating that there are these physical changes that she is undergoing as a result of imbibing all of this vampire blood. Um, but it also just, allowed me to play with, we were talking about the sense of smell earlier. This is allowing me to sort of play with the sense of sight, right? So she's seeing the world in sort of three different ways. She can see it just like a normal human can. Then she can see auras, and now she can also see these heat signatures. And she quickly figures out that she can sort of layer these ways of seeing, and essentially like she becomes capable of like seeing through walls, right? Like she
Mhm.
gets X-ray vision, right? She becomes Superman or whatever. um, and so that was also just kind of a fun sort of thing to play with visually as I was writing the story.
Gotcha. Well, I will not go any further, but I do want to say it was an exceptional book. Listeners at home, buy it, read it, and review it. And I was curious to know, did you learn anything about yourself from writing this book that you didn't realize before? I don't know if that's some people report that when they write a book, they learn something about themselves.
Sure. Um, so like many people who consume horror, I use horror as a support for mental health.
Mhm.
And so it's a way of engaging how horrific this world can be in a safe environment, like right, like I can always put the book down or turn the movie off or walk away from it, or like I can control it. And so therefore, like consuming horror is really cathartic for me. So I am 1,000,000% the person who's like, oh, I'm having a really high anxiety today. I need to watch American Psycho. I'm that person, right?
I
Having
want
trouble
to.
falling asleep. What horror movie, can I watch to put me to sleep, right? To put me to sleep.
Yeah. Yeah.
And oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I always talk about horror writers writing horror to integrate with their shadow.
Oh,
Jung's
self. Yeah,
solution or the way to individuation was integrating with the shadow, not suppressing it, not being subsumed by it, but
right.
integrating with it.
But
Yeah.
integrating it, and absolutely. And so, this book was really me processing grief. And so instead, Zora could act out and go insane so that I didn't have to, right? And so I think that the process of writing this book was incredibly cathartic. And it also just made me aware of how consuming grief can be and how deeply it can alter who you are and how you engage with the world and engage with other people in your life. And so, I mean, I knew that on some level, but then certainly writing some of these scenes, especially with just the intensity of what she's feeling, I'm like, whoa, that is really there's a lot there, like this well, like, and it sometimes really sort of felt like bottomless. But writing it and allowing Zora to, flip out in the ways that she does meant that, I didn't have to, right? Like she was doing it on the page instead. And so I also just really started appreciating how writing is me therapizing myself,
Mhm.
and how important that is to my mental stability and well-being. And I was like, okay, so I need to write all the time for the rest of my life.
Pure catharsis. Well, I saw a video on your social media where you state that you're a pantser. And I imagine that with such a strong background in academia, pantsing is not something you did before fiction writing. Is that correct?
Yeah, no. um,
Well,
yeah.
why do you think you take that approach, or why do you think you approach fiction in this way?
Um, you know, Academic writing is the opposite of pantsing, right? Like you have to have a research question, and then you have to, have outlines and exhaustive, building of the argument. You have to make sure that, all the pieces are there. And I read and teach so much philosophy in my role as a college professor that I'm very used to like all of these structured arguments, none of which you can pants your way through. Exactly. Um, and so really I feel like this is almost using the other side of my brain. And when I initially write, I'm telling myself a story. I just tell myself the story. And I don't really worry about, if I have continuity errors or how long each chapter is, or things like that. It does sort of create problems when I go back to edit, because like when I was editing this manuscript, I had this very rough draft where I just basically told myself this story. And then I was trying to like beat it into something that other people could consume. And like one chapter would be like 500 words and the next one would be like 10,000 words. And I'm like, whoa. But I feel like in some ways my academic training really helps me in the editing process, because I'm like, okay, I have this thing. Now I need to actually put it in a structure and get it to a point where, the chapters are approximately the same length. Each one serves a very specific purpose. And so the creative, just blah onto the page, first part.
Stream
And
of
that's, yeah, total stream of consciousness. And the characters take off on their own and they do these crazy crazy things, and I'm like, what are you doing? But then the editing process is very methodical and structured, and so that's where I think that the two sides, of my brain come together, is in that process.
Mm, gotcha. Well, which writing influence has been the most instrumental in pushing you to move from the imagining of a project to actually completing the work and getting the book written and published?
um I definitely am one of those people who love to write, have always loved to write, and always have written. And I I swallowed that the line that it's really hard to make a living as a writer. And that's why I became an academic. I love academics, don't get me wrong. But I was like, okay, I actually like nice things and I like to travel and I like to have a roof over my head. And so I need money to do that. And so I dedicated sort of the first part of my life to becoming an academic. And I did that. And I am tenured. I'm secure in my job. I have, I keep the roof over our head, things like that. And so several years ago, I was like, okay, I did that. I am successful. Check that box. Now, what do I actually really want to do? And what I really want to do is write. And it takes a lot of discipline to become an academic. And I used that same discipline. I was like, okay, in the next 5 years, here's my plan. um, Step one, write every day. Step two, submit everything all the time, everywhere to publications. Step three, join the Horror Writers Association. Like it was, I'm a nerd, and I just used that same nerdiness to just like approach this work with a great degree of discipline. Um, and so, yeah, so I have really shifted. into being a writer as much as I am an academic within the last 4 years, really 4 years is when I've just been like, I want to write. And I always say, I want to be a writer when I grow up, or I want to be writing is my retirement plan, right? And so, in some ways, like I don't have to worry about money and getting jobs and all of that stuff anymore. I've already done that, which affords me this incredible luxury of freedom to just write and interact with other writers and pursue publication. And I've also gotten lucky. Like people have read my stuff, they've liked it. They're like, "Yeah, I'll publish you," which is great. I'm
Very
super
nice.
grateful.
Well, is there anything you avoid because you feel it stifles your creativity?
um, I mean, all of the answers that come to mind immediately are all like snarky, silly answers. Um,
Those work too. Holy water.
yeah, exactly. Like churches, please. Um, but I mean, I really feel like I I'm a curious person. I'm a naturally curious person, and I am curious about almost everything. And so I seek out weird, random things. I'm always interested in learning. No matter what somebody says that they do for a living, I'm like, tell me all about that. Like, I don't know anything about, whatever. And being an accountant, what is that like for you? um, and so I really feel like I seek things out to feed my creativity and my curiosity and my idea machine. I will say that there are certain things that I definitely do, like I cannot write in a heightened state of anxiety or depression. And so there are certain like mental health things that I do. Like I always say diet, exercise, and sleep. Those are the things that I absolutely have to have. I have to eat well, I have to exercise regularly, and both of those things contribute to sleeping really well. And so if I start letting those things go, my creativity starts to suffer. So I'm pretty militant about safeguarding like certain lifestyle things that I need in order to be able to support my happiness, but also my ability to be creative and productive. So I would say, I avoid toxic people and drama,
Mhm.
like the plague. I avoid things that are going to detract from my ability to take care of myself and be mentally and physically healthy. So I certainly avoid things like that. But that kind of stuff is, well, it's boring. I mean, important, but boring.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, your social media handle is eclectic academic, and rightfully so, citing your interests as religion, sexualities, the paranormal, violence, philosophy, and feminism. Tell me, of all of those, the violence stuck out to me. Tell me about your interest in violence.
Yeah, sure. So I got really interested in religion and violence, and the ways that religion can both promote violence, as many of us are very aware. Religious wars are incredibly bloody, as we're witnessing right now in the world, but also how religion can actually be used to quench violence, to lessen violence. I got really interested in those interactions. And so when I was doing my doctoral work for my PhD, I focused on religion and violence and the question of how religion can both promote violence, but then also address violence. And so I'm really interested in why people do violent things, because my experience, and yes, I am privileged in so many ways, but my experience of the world is not super violent. Like when something bad happens, when somebody has an accident or something like that, what I see is people running to help them. Right. And so, I witnessed a rollover accident a few weeks ago. And what did I see? Everyone pulling over, rushing to help. Right. And so then I'm really interested in what flips for people to commit violent acts against one another, and how in order to commit an act of violence, you have to dehumanize the other person. Like it's really hard to commit an act of violence against someone who you see as a fully autonomous human. So you have to dehumanize them. And I guess that just that psychology is really interesting to me. So yeah, that's why that's why I'm interested in violence. Yeah.
Well, let me see here. I wanted to lay out your academic pedigree. You, you have 2 bachelor's degrees, one in theology and the other in humanities with a minor in creative writing. You have a master's degree in religious studies and a doctorate in philosophical and theological studies. So you are Dr. Ladd. I I should have been addressing you appropriately. I apologize.
No worries. That one is fine.
Well, you teach quite a few things, but one that stuck out to me is epistemology. And the reason I brought up this question was because I myself frequently get into this state of what I would call epistemological nihilism, where I just come to the conclusion that nothing can be known. You know, when I'm thinking about the news, when I'm thinking about politics, when I'm thinking about science, just like I really just rack my brain into this state very frequently. So I was curious to know what it's like to teach about the nature of knowledge, like where you're literally imparting knowledge about knowledge. Does it ever get so meta that you feel like sort of a break with reality?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, all the time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, it's really interesting having these conversations with students because I break their brains. They break from reality. And then as the professor, I have to be like, it'll be okay. Everybody's okay. We'll all be okay together. Like, let's come. It'll be all right.
Do you do grounding techniques, like have them grab their desk and stuff like that?
Sometimes, like if they're really starting to like float away into the ether. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, let's come back together, pick up your pencil, put your hand on your desk. Right. And so, I'm very comfortable with breaks in reality. Because I don't, I don't know. I read Descartes at too young of an age or too impressionable of an age or something. And I very much know, like, we can't actually really prove that anything exists, that anything is really real. Honestly, I've gotten comfortable with that. I think that we were talking earlier about the power of the mind and the power of like belief. And I feel like if we can't know what's real for certain, that in some way that gives us a degree of freedom in deciding for ourselves what has meaning. And so that to me is very empowering because I'm not going to believe that something has meaning because someone told me that it does. I'm going to have to think about, like, do I want that to have meaning? Do I want it to be meaningful in my life? And it gives me a degree of autonomy and control and responsibility that I find actually really freeing, really, encouraging. And so, I always think what the things that I want to have meaning are the things that are loving and life affirming and compassionate, because even if none of those things are real, I would rather believe that those things are real than hatred and discord and anger and violence, right? Like I'm going to it's like my own version of Pascal's wager. I'm going to bet that if anything has meaning, that it is support and empathy and compassion and, all of the good stuff. I'm going to decide that that's what's going to have meaning for me. And so, but it took me a long time to get there. I definitely had these moments where, I would have panic attacks where I'm like, nothing is real. Like, nothing is real. And then I finally got to a point of like, yep, you just have to be comfortable with that.
Like, okay. Are you familiar with Peter Shosted Hughes?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, he pretty much, I think his official position for himself is an ontic agnostic. He's just ontologically, he's like,
Yep.
I don't know if I
Um,
exist or not.
Yep. No, that is absolutely where I am. Yes. I'm
Yeah.
gonna assume that I do, and I'm gonna behave as though I do, but I don't know for sure. All right.
Gotcha. All right. What is the life of Dr. Catlyn Ladd like outside of writing and teaching?
So I love to travel. I've been to over 20 countries at this point. Um, that's a huge part of what I do. My partner and I travel together a lot, both in, around where we live in Colorado, but also all over the world. Um, obviously I love to read. I read all the time, often horror, but not exclusively. I ride a motorcycle. So my partner and I have now taken two trips to Canada from where we live in Colorado. We went to
Nice.
Vancouver Island and then we went to Banff most recently. And so we put thousands of miles on the motorcycles. um, and so, yeah, I would say that I teach, I write, I read, I travel, and I eat. I love food. Food is the best thing. I love food. So definitely a foodie. We eat all over the world. Yeah, and then when I'm not doing any of those things, I'm usually watching horror movies.
Nice.
Yeah,
That'll work.
totally.
Well, Catlin, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks so much for having me. This was super fun.
Absolutely. So, as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about?
Sure. So, the vampire novel, As Those Above Fall, hits shelves on September 13th. So, just a little under a month from our conversation today. It's available for pre order now, anywhere that you get books. And then I also have a whole bunch of my short fiction that's been published, but the rights have reverted to me up on my website, which is catlynladd.com, that people can read for free. And so I never ask people to order or buy the book unless they know that they're going to like my writing. And there's a whole bunch of writing that I have up on my website that people can go check out and then decide if they want to order As Those Above Fall, which I hope you do, because I had fun writing it and I would love people to read it and review it and, tell me what they think about it.
You will want to read it, folks. Trust me. All right. As for everybody that tuned in, thank you to all the live listeners at home. All links are in the description. And Catlin, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can watch the episodes live. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest writers and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.